They kicked his bag down the aisle like it was trash, like he was trash, without warning, without a word, just because of the color of his skin. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He picked it up while eyes stared, while whispers passed, while flight attendants moved on like nothing had happened. That was the moment everything started to unravel, not for him, but for them. Because the man they dismissed, the one they thought they could humiliate and walk past, wasn't who they thought he was. But the truth, the real truth, doesn't explode. It waits. It watches. And when it arrives, it rewrites everything. If this opening hit you like this story, subscribe so you won't miss the next twist, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And how do you think this ends? Langston Miles walked through the terminal like a man who belonged. His steps were calm, deliberate. He wore a tailored charcoal suit with a faint pinstripe, the shoulders cut sharp, the fabric clean. His dark brown shoes made a rhythmic tap across the polished floor, echoing softly against the sleek glass and brushed metal walls. A leather briefcase, burnished and well cared for, swung lightly at his side. Everything about his appearance spoke of someone who had paid his dues. No fuss, no noise, just presence. At gate 42A, the boarding process had just begun. The screen above the podium displayed the flight number in crisp blue text. First-class passengers, now boarding. Langston held up his phone, showing the pass that confirmed his seat. 2A, window side, first class. The gate agent, a young woman with a smooth ponytail and thick mascara, gave him a mechanical smile. She didn't speak, didn't welcome him aboard like she had with the white couple in front of him. She barely looked at the barcode as she scanned it. When the reader beeped, her eyes narrowed. She glanced at the screen longer than necessary. No one said there was a problem. Nothing was wrong. But the look, something subtle in the pause, the forced smile that came too late, unsettled the moment. It wasn't a refusal, but it wasn't an invitation either. Without a word, she gestured toward the jet bridge. Langston offered a polite nod and continued. These weren't unfamiliar cues. They were just another layer of dust on the world's surface, hard to see if you didn't know where to look. The jet bridge was cool, lined with a stale scent of fabric and recycled air. At the plane's entrance, a steward stood angled into the aisle, blocking it as he secured a service cart. He didn't acknowledge Langston as he waited. When he finally stepped aside, the smile he offered was thin, mechanical. Langston passed with a nod and entered the quiet hum of first class. Only a few seats were occupied. His was at the front, 2A, beside the window. He approached, set down his briefcase, and reached up to open the overhead bin. As his fingers touched the handle, a flight attendant appeared, blonde, youthful, with the bright, too-practiced tone of someone trained to suppress emotion. She reached out without asking and took the briefcase from his hand. Her motion was fluid, confident. Langston blinked, slightly startled. Before he could speak, she turned and walked the bag down the aisle, storing it in an overhead bin several rows behind. When she returned, she moved past him without a glance. He sat down. No apology, no offer, just gone. It was small, forgettable even, but it settled on him like the first pebble in a rock slide. The seat beside him remained empty for several minutes. Then a woman entered. Late 50s, pale skin, silver blonde hair in a carefully set wave. She walked with an air of command. Her husband followed, tall and ruddy-faced in a linen blazer and worn leather shoes. When she saw her seat, 2B, next to Langston, she stopped. A subtle pause, barely a second. Then she turned to the nearest flight attendant and asked if there was another available seat. She didn't look at Langston. Her voice wasn't hushed. She said it as though discussing the weather. The attendant apologized and informed her there were no alternatives. The woman didn't reply. She simply exhaled and took her seat stiffly, placing her purse firmly between them like a barrier. The silence was louder than any insult. Langston turned his face to the window, watching the luggage carts circle below. It was too early to call it anything, but the unease bloomed in his chest like something old and familiar. The cabin filled slowly. A pair of businessmen clinked glasses 2 rows behind him. A steward passed by offering flutes of champagne. The passenger next to him accepted one without hesitation. When Langston reached for his, he was handed a plastic cup filled with room-temperature water. No explanation. No acknowledgement. He said nothing. His voice remained folded away. The plane pulled from the gate, and the hum of the engine began to rise. Langston adjusted the tray in front of him, folded his hands neatly over his lap, and closed his eyes. It wasn't rage that stirred in his chest. It was resignation. The knowledge that certain faces always raised questions in places where silence was supposed to greet you. 30 minutes in, meal service began. The aroma of warm seafood and garlic butter filled the cabin. Passengers were handed menus, given options. When the steward reached Langston, he offered one pre-plated dish without speaking. Langston nodded and accepted it. The salmon was dry. The rice was cold. The couple beside him were given fresh plates moments later, theirs hot to the touch. Langston said nothing. He chewed quietly, napkin folded over his leg. Across the aisle, a man leaned back in his seat, glanced over, and chuckled. Langston didn't catch the joke, but the glance lingered too long, and the smirk on the man's face wasn't friendly. A few seats back, someone snapped a photo of their dessert, catching Langston's profile in the corner. No effort was made to retake it. He simply became part of the background, uninvited, unnoticed. Somewhere over Indiana, the turbulence started. Not enough to shake the plane, just enough to rattle loose anything pretending to be calm. The woman beside him clutched her armrest, her breath shallow. Langston remained still, his expression unchanged. When it passed, she exhaled and looked at him like he'd failed some private test. She shifted in her seat. The purse stayed in place. Another round of drinks was offered. The man across from Langston was handed scotch in a glass tumbler. Langston was ignored until he flagged down the steward. The drink that came was flat, served with ice cubes floating half-melted in a paper cup. The apology never arrived. At hour 2, a child from coach wandered into the cabin, barefoot and sticky with candy fingers. He climbed into the aisle and bumped Langston's shoulder. A moment later, the mother appeared and tugged the boy away, eyes flicking toward Langston without a word. No sorry. Just a glance of instinctive distrust, like a warning passed in silence. The second stage of the quiet rejection began not with confrontation, but with calculated performance, subtle dismantling of image, carried out with practiced precision. As the cabin crew made another pass through first class, Langston lifted his hand gently to request a napkin to clean the condensation building up on his drink, the plastic cups still mocking him while his neighbors clinked their crystal glasses. But the flight attendant who noticed him made no effort to respond. She acknowledged every passenger in the row ahead and behind, but when her gaze passed over Langston, it held the sharp vacancy of intentional neglect, as if he were furniture and not a man, as if to validate his presence would require validating his right to occupy this space. He dropped his hand back to the armrest, offering no reaction, simply returning to the window, and the view outside, now buried in clouds. His posture remained correct, his jacket smooth, his breathing measured, but each second in silence deepened the cavity where dignity had once rested. Then came the passenger from across the aisle, a man in a patterned blue tie and an air of entitlement so strong it preceded his words. He stood up, stretched dramatically, and turned toward Langston with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, then asked him, without invitation, whether he was flying for work or something else. His tone laced with the kind of assumption that required no facts. Langston turned his head slightly, answered with polite brevity, offering as little as possible, hoping to cut the exchange short. The man, undeterred, nodded slowly, then followed up by saying he hadn't seen Langston at the pre-boarding lounge, as though that proved something. Langston didn't answer this time. The man smirked, chuckled softly to himself, and returned to his seat, muttering a comment that drew a laugh from the woman seated beside him. Langston couldn't hear every word, but what little reached him didn't need clarification. It was not spoken to him. It was spoken around him, spoken to remind others of his exception, not his inclusion. Minutes passed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the sun dipped behind the clouds, turning the space into a glowing capsule of quiet privilege. The hum of the engine served as a backdrop for soft music piping through personal headsets, and whispered gossip passed between wine-slick lips. Langston reached for the in-flight entertainment system, only to find his touchscreen unresponsive. He tapped gently. Nothing. Pressed the help button. Waited. Nothing. A stewardess passed his row. He raised his hand again. She looked toward him, paused, and continued on. Seconds later, the passenger next to him received assistance for a minor issue with his headphones. Langston watched in silence, slowly lowering his hand. With the lights lowered, the cabin became colder. He unfolded the thin blanket that had been handed to him much later than the others and draped it over his lap. It smelled faintly of antiseptic, not laundered like the others appeared to be. When dinner service began, the attention given to Langston's row grew unbalanced. The couple across from him received a full menu selection, their entrees served with finesse and a gentle flourish. When the cart reached him, the flight attendant did not offer choices. She handed him a tray with a covered dish, said nothing, and moved on. When he removed the lid, the chicken was pale and overcooked, the rice dry, the vegetables underseasoned. His water remained lukewarm. The woman beside him, who had not spoken since she took her seat, glanced over at his tray, then looked away with pursed lips. Langston ate slowly, without appetite, finishing enough to avoid appearing rude. The fork was slightly bent. He did not request a replacement. When the trays were cleared, his was collected last, left sitting in front of him as the others received fresh towels and after-dinner drinks. He waited. The towel never came. The coffee was poured for others, but skipped over him. He could feel the weight of unspoken rules closing in around him. Invisible guidelines only applied to him, and always enforced without direct confrontation. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, smoothed the crease of his slacks, trying to preserve what little control he had left over his appearance. As he settled into his seat again, a steward passed by and commented to another crew member that some passengers had a tendency to overdress for short-haul flights. It wasn't said to him, but it was said within earshot. The other attendant laughed, following it with a remark about how people thought a suit could buy them a seat at the table. Langston sat still, eyes forward, breathing carefully. The two crew members didn't look in his direction, but their performance was clearly staged for those around them to hear. No one objected. No one defended. No one questioned. It was a public broadcast disguised as casual commentary. The next wave came when a woman from coach wandered into the first-class cabin looking confused. She paused near Langston's seat and asked him if he was staff, her voice hopeful, eager, almost apologetic when she realized he wasn't. He didn't respond, simply turned away again. She stood awkwardly before retreating back behind the curtain. As she disappeared, a passenger behind him chuckled and asked aloud whether airlines were hiring a new tier of in-cabin support. More laughter followed. Microaggressions. Langston closed his eyes, his fingers lightly gripping the armrest. He had not responded once. Not because he lacked words, but because his words would never be welcomed in this space, not as protest, not as defense, not even as acknowledgement. He had long learned that dignity, when spoken, could be treated as defiance. Silence preserved what pride remained, but the damage was being done. Slowly, ruthlessly. He could feel it settle in his stomach, heavy and cold, like something rotten blooming beneath his skin. But there was no room to express it. Not here. Not among these people. Not in a place where his mere existence was already treated as disruption. The moments that followed continued to sharpen that knife. As the steward made another sweep down the aisle, he paused by Langston's seat and looked at him with forced neutrality. Without explanation, he asked Langston to stand for a routine headcount verification. Langston, now accustomed to the arbitrary rituals being thrust on him, stood up slowly, careful to keep his movements controlled, precise, inoffensive. As he stood, several passengers turned their heads. One man snorted softly, muttering a joke to his seatmate about surprise audits. The woman across the aisle folded her arms and narrowed her eyes like she was watching a security check unfold. No other passenger was asked to stand. No one else was counted. Langston stood in the aisle for 30 seconds while the attendant flipped through a manifest and made a show of pretending to double-check details. When it was over, he offered no apology, simply gestured that Langston could return to his seat. He did so without comment, but the tightening in his chest refused to release. It was not the inspection that stung, it was the public nature of it. The way it was done, without privacy, without cause, without dignity, like a man being paraded through a room not to be checked, but to be displayed, to remind the others that he did not belong. Minutes later, as the plane entered another stretch of smooth air, Langston's name was mispronounced over the intercom. It came in the form of an announcement for the passenger in seat 2A to please identify himself for a meal confirmation. The first time it happened, he was startled, unsure if he'd heard it right. The second time, he was certain. The pronunciation was mangled, twisted into something unrecognizable, made clumsy and sharp like it had been butchered on purpose. The third time, it was followed by a small chuckle from someone behind him. A woman 2 seats over smirked and whispered something to her companion. He heard the muffled laughter, but not the words. The damage was done regardless. Langston responded with a quiet nod to the stewardess, who eventually approached him. She offered no apology for the mispronunciation. She didn't correct herself. She simply confirmed the meal preference and walked away. Her face was blank. The announcement had done its job. The humiliation was no longer silent. It had become performance. The erosion of his image, once done quietly and behind closed interactions, had now shifted into something open. It wasn't just that Langston was being excluded. He was being made into a symbol, a target, a spectacle. The passengers were now complicit, some with their laughter, some with their indifference. Langston's presence had become an invitation for cruelty, and no one had stepped in to stop it. When he requested a fresh bottle of water to replace the warm cup that had been handed to him hours ago, he was told there were none remaining. Yet he watched as another bottle was pulled from a cooler and handed to a younger white man a few rows behind him. Langston didn't argue. He nodded and leaned back in his seat, watching the overhead lights flicker slightly as the cabin dimmed again. The air grew colder. His blanket, still carrying that faint chemical smell, did little to ward it off. He folded it neatly and set it aside. Even the things given to him felt borrowed, tainted, temporary. The couple seated across from him began to play a quiet game of cards, their conversation casual, unconcerned. The man glanced up once and made direct eye contact with Langston, holding it just long enough to establish superiority before turning back to his hand. It was a small act, but it stung. It wasn't about the game. It was about the assertion, the reminder. One of the flight attendants returned shortly after and approached Langston's row. Without preamble, she bent forward and inspected the floor beneath the seat. After a pause, she asked if he had dropped anything. He hadn't. She remained crouched for a moment, then stood and walked away, saying nothing further. The man seated behind Langston laughed again, this time louder, remarking that they were probably checking for crumbs or fingerprints. His voice carried. The laughter spread, shallow and ugly. Langston did not move. He stared forward, his fingers folded neatly on his lap. The humiliation was no longer subtle. It had become the entertainment. The slow, public stripping of his identity was now feeding the social theater that first class had turned into. The whispers, the glances, the pointed commentary. They were no longer isolated events. They were a chorus. And Langston remained the lone figure on stage, made to endure it in silence, because to speak up would be seen as aggression, and aggression would only justify what was already being done to him. The final blow came when another steward arrived with a clipboard, eyes scanning down the page, before stopping at Langston's seat. He asked for Langston's identification. Langston blinked. He was the only passenger being asked. The steward said it was standard for high-tier flyer verification, something about matching internal records. Langston hesitated, then slowly retrieved his wallet and handed over his ID. The steward took it without thanks, glanced at it, and nodded. Then he returned it and walked away. The moment was quiet. but everyone around had seen it. No one else was asked for identification. Not one. Langston sat back slowly, the weight of it settling onto his chest like a stone. It wasn't just that he had been asked. It was how. In front of others. With no explanation. No warning. Like a man pulled from line and searched just for existing. Still, Langston had said nothing, moved nothing, but the man who had boarded the plane as a symbol of calm composure now sat slightly more rigid, slightly more guarded, his expression still unreadable, but no longer at ease. The air inside the cabin had turned colder again, the vents above hissing softly as the climate controls shifted without warning. The blanket provided to Langston remained folded in his lap, useless for warmth, but he kept it there as a barrier, a placeholder for dignity in a space designed to strip it away piece by piece. As the crew began their next round of service, the energy in the cabin shifted yet again. A tray of hot towels was passed through first class, each passenger receiving one with tongs and a polite nod. Langston watched as the attendants reached his row, met his eyes, and then skipped him entirely. The cart moved past him as if he were invisible. The woman beside him received a towel with a smile. She didn't look at him. She didn't offer hers. Langston remained still. His hands stayed folded. No protest. No request. Just silence. It wasn't about the towel. It was about the principle, the repetition, the message. He wasn't here to be served. He was here to be tolerated. A burden permitted only because of a transaction, not because of any earned respect. Minutes later, the turbulence returned, soft at first, then stronger. The plane dipped slightly and trembled, and passengers clutched their seats or adjusted their posture. Langston stayed calm, but the woman beside him let out a soft gasp and grabbed the armrest between them, her fingers brushing his. She immediately recoiled, wiped her hand on her dress, and leaned away, as if his presence added to the instability. He did not look at her. He did not react, but he felt the weight of the gesture pressed down on his chest like a lead blanket. A moment later, the steward returned with a tray of ginger ale and soda water, asking passengers if they needed refreshments to help with the movement. He offered choices to each row, but when he reached Langston, he didn't ask. He simply placed a half-filled cup of warm ginger ale on Langston's tray table and moved on without a word. The cup was sticky. Langston didn't touch it. He stared at it for several seconds, the ice already melting, the surface of the liquid rippling from the plane's soft movements. It was a symbol now, service reduced to obligation, dignity reduced to indifference. Not even the courtesy of asking, not even the decency of care, just a gesture to fulfill a technical requirement, and even that delivered with contempt. As the turbulence passed and the plane regained smooth air, the attendant returned again, this time with the in-flight immigration forms required for international arrival. He handed them to each passenger with a pen and a brief explanation. When he reached Langston, he did not offer a pen. He tossed the form onto Langston's tray with a flick of his wrist, the corner curling slightly under the cup. No words, no instructions, just the form. Langston picked it up slowly, smoothed the edge, and retrieved his own pen from his coat pocket. The ink flowed smoothly across the paper, each letter of his name written with deliberate care, each box checked with precision. As he wrote, the man behind him leaned forward and coughed, once, twice, loudly and close. Langston ignored it. The man didn't apologize, didn't lean back. He just lingered there for a moment, then mumbled something about getting sick every time he flew next to someone with cologne that smelled too strong. Langston hadn't worn cologne. The scent the man described wasn't his. But the implication hung there, bitter and unspoken. Another attack. Another accusation without a name. After forms were collected, the lights dimmed again for the scheduled rest period. Passengers reclined their seats, adjusted their neck pillows, and settled into the hum of altitude and time. Langston tried to do the same. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and focused on his breath, slow and measured. But sleep did not come. The cabin was too tense, too charged, and his body too aware of every detail. Every skipped courtesy, every whispered insult, every small act that had chipped away at his humanity from the moment he boarded. He drifted in and out of a shallow, fragmented awareness, neither fully awake nor asleep. Then came a jolt, not from the plane, but from a flight attendant who nudged his arm, informing him that his seat needed to be returned to upright position, despite the cabin still being in rest mode. Langston opened his eyes, blinked, confused, then obeyed. He looked around. Other seats remained reclined. The man across the aisle slept with his mouth open, blanket draped across his chest, seat tilted far back. Langston was the only one being corrected. The message was clear. Even in rest, there was no rest for him. No comfort. No reprieve. Not even the illusion of equality. He sat upright, eyes open, the weight in his chest now spreading through his limbs, making his fingers feel heavy, his shoulders tight. He inhaled slowly, exhaled, and focused on the rhythmic drone of the engines. An hour later, the lights returned, and the cabin began to stir for final meal service. Langston's tray table still bore a faint sticky ring from the ginger ale. No one had cleaned it. No one offered to. He wiped it himself with the edge of a napkin folded from a previous service. The breakfast was distributed with cheerful voices and pleasant greetings. When the tray reached him, the meal was missing a side item. The fruit was underripe. The bread was cold. No water. The coffee was served without sugar or cream. When he asked, he was told they had run out. But again, he watched as another passenger received both just moments later. The lies were effortless now, second nature. They didn't need to be justified. They didn't even try. As the flight began its descent, the steward returned to collect headsets and remaining service items. When he reached Langston, he asked to see the customs declaration again. Langston handed it over without a word. The steward looked at it for a long moment, as if searching for something, then nodded and returned it. He did not say, "Thank you." He did not smile. He just left. The seatbelt sign illuminated. The crew began safety reminders. Langston sat upright, hands on his thighs, shoulders square, head forward. Every muscle in his body felt tense, coiled, burning with a quiet ache. He had survived the erosion of comfort, the deliberate omissions, the whispered accusations dressed as jokes, and the denial of basic courtesies. Yet what weighed heaviest now was not the accumulation of slights, but the understanding that none of it had been random. It had been a test of boundaries conducted in plain sight, the cruelty methodical, refined, practiced with the confidence of those who knew they could not be challenged. The descent continued, and the pilot's voice came through the speaker, calm and cheerful, delivering the same familiar phrases about expected arrival time and current weather at the destination. But for Langston, the sound carried no reassurance. It was just another voice passing overhead, another layer of sound meant for people not him. As the wheels touched the tarmac and the plane slowed with a slight jolt, Langston kept his hands folded tightly in his lap, his jaw tense. Around him, passengers began to stretch, check phones, and talk about their connections or meetings or beachside getaways, as though the last several hours had unfolded in a vacuum, untouched by cruelty or discomfort. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the lead steward passed through first class with a clipboard, making notations. When he reached Langston's row, he paused, not with the neutrality of someone completing a checklist, but with a calculated slowness. He looked at Langston for a moment too long, then scribbled something and moved on without a word. Langston felt it in his gut, the sense that something unseen had just happened, something meant to become a record without truth, a written version of events crafted to control the story after it ended. The seatbelt sign dimmed, and the soft chimes signaled permission to stand, but Langston remained seated, watching the people around him retrieve their overhead bags and exchange polite goodbyes with the crew. As he finally rose and stepped into the aisle, the man behind him bumped his shoulder roughly while reaching for his bag, then looked at Langston as if daring him to react. Langston did not respond. He simply stepped aside, allowed the man to pass, and took a breath so deep it made his ribs ache. The aisle cleared slowly, and as Langston moved forward, one of the junior attendants intercepted him. She was polite, almost apologetic in her tone, and asked him to step aside for just a moment. Her voice was soft, but the request carried weight. He followed without speaking, led to the small galley near the exit where another uniformed attendant waited, flanked by two men in plain clothes wearing earpieces and clipped ID badges. They introduced themselves as airport security liaison officers, requesting Langston's cooperation for a brief verification. The reason, they said, was a flagged report filed during the flight about possible suspicious behavior. Langston stood still, blinking once, the words registering not as shock, but as confirmation. He had known it would come. He had felt the shape of it being formed midair, word by word, glance by glance, from the moment his name was mispronounced to the moment his ID was unnecessarily checked, to the scribble on that clipboard only minutes ago. It had all led to this. He asked calmly what behavior had been flagged, but the officers simply responded that they were required to follow protocol whenever a report was filed, and that this would be handled quickly if he cooperated. Langston reached into his coat pocket and provided his passport and boarding pass. The officer studied it, then asked for a second form of identification. Langston produced his work badge, showing his photo, full name, and role at the global consultancy firm he had helped restructure from the ground up. The badge was examined, then returned. The second officer, expression unreadable, nodded and stepped back, but not before noting something on a small tablet. Langston knew it was another entry, another version of a story where he had no authorship. He asked if he was free to go. They said yes, but advised him to stay in the terminal until they closed the file on their system. A formality, they added. Just routine. Langston nodded, thanked them without emotion, and stepped back into the corridor where the terminal was beginning to fill with passengers from other flights. The terminal buzzed with the energy of movement, of connections, of reunions and departures. Langston walked slowly toward the baggage claim, each step echoing in his mind like a drumbeat of restraint. His phone buzzed, a calendar alert reminding him of his scheduled boardroom presentation later that afternoon. He silenced it, stared at the screen for a long second, then pocketed the phone. He arrived at the baggage carousel and waited as the belt began to spin, the first of the bags thudding onto the metal ramp. The passengers from his flight gathered nearby in small groups, chatting, laughing, typing rapidly into phones, oblivious. Langston stood apart. As his bag finally appeared, scuffed and slightly unzipped, he stepped forward and retrieved it. A folded note had been inserted between the zipper teeth. He opened it. A flight service form marked, inspected due to irregular activity. He crumpled it slowly in his fist, closed his bag, and turned toward the exit. Outside the terminal, the sun had risen fully, washing the sidewalk in a pale, clear light. A driver holding a sign with Langston's name approached. He gave a small nod and followed the man toward the sedan. The doors opened, and he slid into the back seat, finally exhaling. As the car pulled away, the glass shield between him and the driver seemed to offer a moment of solitude. The airport security officers had said it was routine, a protocol response to a mid-flight report. But Langston knew better than to take such explanations at face value. He had seen how institutions work, had helped build some of their systems, had advised executives on how to shape compliance to match optics. He knew how a notation in the wrong place could alter the shape of a man's future interactions, not overtly, not immediately, but subtly and inevitably. Now that shape was his. The ride to the corporate headquarters was smooth, the car gliding through the city's veins like a ghost, the skyline punctuated by towering offices he had once viewed with pride. The driver said nothing, professional and silent, which suited Langston fine. By the time they reached the downtown district, the weight in his chest had settled into something colder, denser. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the marble lobby of his firm's regional office, nodding once to the receptionist, who greeted him with a familiar polite smile. Inside the elevator, he straightened his tie, checked the crease in his trousers, and adjusted the cuff of his jacket as though the routine might center him again. But the internal shaking had not stopped. The boardroom was already partially full when he entered. His presence was acknowledged with a few nods, some hellos, but nothing lingering. He took his seat at the head of the table and waited for the last of the participants to arrive before beginning his presentation. As he moved through the data, the policy forecasts, the strategic plans for expansion into new regulatory spaces, his voice did not waver. His slide transitions remained smooth, and his composure never cracked. But inside, he felt the tremor still humming from beneath his skin. After the meeting, the regional director pulled him aside for a quick word. There had been a notification from their travel security provider, a flag noting a minor discrepancy at the arrival checkpoint. Nothing major, just a notation. Langston asked calmly what it meant. The director, uncertain, said the report had been vague, something about behavior on the plane. It didn't say who filed it. It didn't say what the behavior was. It was just there, a file, an alert, a digital echo now attached to his name. Langston nodded, thanked the man, and walked back to his office with a pace slower than before. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and logged into the firm's compliance system. He navigated to the traveler risk profiles, searched his own name, and found the note already embedded. It was tagged moderate concern, with no supporting detail beyond a generic line about in-flight disruption. He stared at the words until the screen blurred, then closed the file. The system had responded, and the system had chosen not to ask him for his version. In the days that followed, Langston noticed the effects begin to spread like oil across water, subtle and hard to contain. His upcoming overseas engagement was reassigned to a colleague under the justification of streamlining resources. His access to the firm's priority travel portal was temporarily restricted due to a procedural review. The administrative assistant who handled executive travel bookings informed him of these changes in a tone that suggested she didn't understand them either, just following protocol. It was how the system defended itself, by hiding behind policies no one had written, but everyone obeyed. Langston didn't protest. He had learned by now that objections were recorded louder than silence. Instead, he adjusted. He waited. He watched. But the watching only revealed more erosion. His profile, once considered impeccable, now carried a quiet mark. And with that mark came suspicion, not loud or accusatory, but present in every delayed email reply, every change in meeting tone, every pause before people said his name. The effect was ambient, like background radiation, unseen but slowly, unmistakably damaging. The airline had not contacted him. There had been no apology, no inquiry, no mention of the incident. He considered reaching out, but he already knew the response that would come. Generic language about policy enforcement and safety protocols, apologies for inconvenience, assurances that all passengers were treated equally. He had read those words in other cases, in other reports, in the aftermath of other so-called incidents. They were not meant to address harm. They were meant to avoid liability. Then came the message that shifted the ground beneath him further. A longtime client reached out to the firm expressing concern. They had been alerted, through their own security channel, to the notation attached to Langston's name. They wanted to know if it was something they should be aware of before renewing their advisory contract. The question was framed diplomatically, but the subtext was unmistakable. Langston was now a liability, not because of any action he had taken, but because of a narrative seeded through formal channels without his input, watered by assumptions, and grown into a quiet threat. The regional director called him in again, this time with a tone of measured concern. He said the firm was obligated to review the situation internally to protect client interests. It wasn't punitive, he assured Langston, just procedural. Langston smiled faintly and said he understood. But inside, something cracked further. He left the building later that evening, without saying goodbye, walked past the security desk without looking up, and stepped into the night where the city lights shimmered against the wet pavement. The rain had started without warning, light but steady, washing over the sidewalks and hoods of passing cars like a cleansing that offered no forgiveness. He walked for several blocks, his breath forming clouds in the air, his thoughts racing without direction. The system had spoken again, not loudly, not directly, but decisively. The same machine that had welcomed him, promoted him, praised him, had now begun to rewrite him. One note, one report, one unchecked accusation. That was all it had taken. His identity had been reduced to a keyword in a database, a flag in a profile, a hesitation in someone else's voice. Langston's entrance brought only scattered glances, not disrespectful, not welcoming, but careful, as if his presence now required calibration. He carried no briefcase this time, only a black folder containing documents printed on thick official paper. And as he placed it on the table in front of him and sat down at his assigned seat, he took one long breath through his nose and exhaled slowly, anchoring himself. The meeting began with routine updates, projections, client engagement summaries, compliance audits. But Langston did not engage, did not interrupt, did not shift his gaze. He waited. When the director addressed the flagged incident and mentioned an internal review, there was a pause in the room. Not long, just a momentary hesitation that hovered in the air like held breath. Langston finally raised his eyes and asked for the floor. His voice was steady, clear, and measured. He was granted permission, without enthusiasm. He opened the folder and began to speak, not from anger, not from resentment, but from clarity that had been earned through endurance. First, he presented his travel credentials: long-term clearance through multiple international vetting systems, risk-free assessments from government and private channels, a history of corporate travel that spanned over a decade without a single recorded issue. Then he introduced the case study that none of them expected, the one he had never spoken of in meetings or company bios, the one tied to a name known in federal circles but unlinked in corporate corridors. He presented his service records, not just as a civilian consultant, but as a decorated operations strategist for a federal counterintelligence agency, serving under an alias for years during one of the most complex global intelligence programs in recent history. He laid out clearance levels, commendations, operational summaries redacted for security but verified through formal codes, and then looked directly at the director and said that the reason he had remained silent was not weakness, but habit. Silence had once been required for national security. Silence had once been mission protocol. What they had mistaken for passive compliance had, in fact, been discipline. What they had treated as a lack of resistance had been control. The room shifted. Eyes narrowed. The air tightened. The lawyer seated 2 seats to his left reached slowly for his pen and began to write. Langston continued. He produced copies of communications with federal travel clearance agencies, including a recent memo confirming his participation in classified policy restructuring that placed him in strategic positions requiring enhanced security protection. He explained that the flagged report from the airline not only constituted a false record, but had triggered concern within a parallel agency that had since opened a quiet investigation into racial bias in passenger profiling procedures. The implications of that investigation, he noted, would eventually reach public awareness. He did not say it as a threat. He said it as fact. The silence in the room changed color. It went from casual disinterest to professional alarm. He addressed the senior partner seated across the table and said that while he appreciated the firm's previous trust in his leadership, the recent suspension and client reassignment had compromised not only his standing, but the firm's exposure to legal and reputational liability. He placed a sealed envelope on the table and said it contained correspondence from his private legal representation outlining the options now under review, including litigation if necessary. He paused, allowed that sentence to land, then said that while he had no desire to escalate, he would not permit his identity to be reshaped by silence any longer. Then he ended his presentation. The room remained still. The director said they would need to regroup. Langston nodded, stood, collected his folder, and left the room. That was the moment everything began to change. Not because he had threatened them, but because the truth he carried was now undeniable. He had not needed to shout. He had not needed to demand. All he had done was reveal the depth of the man they had tried to diminish. It spread quickly after that. The firm launched an internal investigation, this time not about him, but about the process that had allowed such a suspension to occur without verification. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Teams were reassigned. Policies were re-examined. And while some tried to downplay the impact, Others understood that something more powerful had been exposed, the cost of complacency. But the reach of Langston's revelation did not end there. News of his background began to circulate discreetly through professional networks. Former associates contacted him, offering discreet support. A letter arrived from a federal liaison confirming their interest in conducting a full review of profiling protocols at the airline. Langston did not reply immediately. He waited. He watched. He observed how people now looked at him with confusion, with caution, with a growing awareness that the man they had discounted had once sat in rooms they would never access, had once shaped decisions that shaped policy. In quiet ways, reparation attempts began. Langston had agreed, but not to accommodate them. He had agreed because truth, once awakened, demanded presence. He had agreed because the people who had tried to erase him would now be required to look at what they had tried to bury. Across the room, the airline's vice president of customer relations approached with two other executives in tow, dressed in tailored suits and guarded smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They extended hands. Langston shook them, firm and silent. He was offered a seat. He declined the lounge coffee. He brought his own bottle of water and placed it on the table in front of him, a small act of control in a space where every detail had once been used to strip control from him. The VP began with carefully constructed language, apologizing for the experience, acknowledging the inconsistencies, promising they were reviewing their policies and retraining staff. Langston listened, not interrupting, not nodding, just listening with a stillness that made every word hang heavier than the last. When the VP paused, Langston opened a folder identical in size and shape to the one he had used in the boardroom weeks earlier. This one contained photographs, transcripts, and annotated timelines constructed from the flight records, staff manifests, passenger testimonials, and surveillance footage recovered through a quiet inquiry by the Federal Compliance Board, now conducting a parallel investigation. He placed each item on the table with deliberate care. Not all at once, one at a time. With every new document came a new truth. A steward's casual remark caught on the internal crew channel. A seating manifest, showing he had been the only passenger subjected to additional identification checks. A flagged report without details, filed 20 minutes after he had asked for water and been ignored. A written statement from the woman seated next to him, confirming she had overheard derogatory remarks made by two flight attendants during turbulence. The executives stopped speaking. Their silence bloomed into something more than discomfort. It became fear, not of Langston himself, but of what he represented now. Accountability, exposure, consequence. Langston looked each of them in the eye and asked why his presence had required proof. Why his request for service had been treated as entitlement. Why silence had been mistaken for submission. He asked why dignity had to be earned again and again from people whose only power came from uniforms and proximity to control. The VP responded with more polished regret, offering to issue a public apology, to arrange a meeting with the crew involved, to provide travel compensation and additional membership perks. Langston smiled faintly and said he had not come for perks. He had come for change. He opened the second envelope and revealed the drafted proposal prepared by federal auditors, outlining a new framework for anti-bias protocol in first-class cabins, requiring quarterly review of crew interactions, randomized passenger audits, and direct accountability pathways, bypassing internal management. He asked if they would support the program. Their answer would be on record. The VP hesitated, glanced at his legal advisor, then nodded. Langston asked if the crew from the flight had been suspended. The VP confirmed they were under administrative review. Langston asked if passengers who had participated in verbal harassment had been identified. The VP said it was under investigation. Langston asked how many complaints the airline had received in the last 12 months regarding racial disparities in premium seating service. The VP said he did not have the numbers on hand. Langston reached into his folder and gave them the number. 73. Langston asked how many of those were resolved with meaningful action. The VP remained silent. Langston gave them that number too. 5. He stood up slowly, letting the weight of that final number fill the space like smoke. He said nothing else. He left the documents on the table, picked up his bottle of water, and walked toward the exit. He did not look back. Behind him, the executives remained seated, surrounded by the paper architecture of their own failings. The meeting had not been about justice alone. It had been about reflection, about turning the mirror back onto the hands that had shaped the humiliation and forcing them to see the reflection clearly. Outside the lounge, the terminal was alive with movement. Travelers dragging bags, families reuniting, businessmen pacing with phones to ears. Langston walked through them unnoticed, just another figure in the flow of bodies. But something in his posture had changed. Not just strength, not just purpose. It was certainty. The truth had been spoken in a room that once upheld lies. It had been recorded. It had been heard. The executives who had once dismissed Langston's silent presence now found themselves summoned for interviews, their statements recorded, their decision-making scrutinized line by line. The crew from the original flight was removed from duty pending final review, but before verdict was delivered, one of them posted a cryptic message on a private forum used by industry professionals, referencing the incident and mocking the investigation as nothing more than optics management. That message leaked. It was screen-captured, archived, and distributed across platforms by advocacy groups and former passengers who had quietly endured similar treatment without resolution. The outrage grew, not in fury, but in volume, swelling into a collective demand for answers. Major news outlets picked up the story, first local, then national, driven by documents obtained through public information requests and whistleblower interviews. The tone was unmistakable. This was no longer about one flight or one man. It was about a structure that had operated for too long without oversight, about dignity quietly denied under the shield of policy. The airline stock, once stable and unshaken, began to slip. Investors held calls behind closed doors, pressing executives for assurances that never came. Questions multiplied. Who had approved the report filed against Langston Miles? Who had verified it? Who had decided that his identification needed further inspection when no other passenger had been flagged? Why had his file remained flagged even after verification? And why had no one spoken up? Legal teams scrambled to compile statements, issued press releases filled with carefully worded apologies and commitments to diversity training. Yet each new message only widened the gap between the corporation and public trust. In less than 2 weeks, 3 major corporate partners quietly withdrew from long-standing contracts with the airline, citing reputational risk. One of them, a billion-dollar logistics firm, confirmed that their executive travel had been moved to a competitor effective immediately. Another, an international bank, released a memo to staff stating they would not support partnerships with organizations under federal review for civil rights violations. The collapse had begun, not dramatic, not sudden, but irreversible. Inside the airline's internal chat rooms, panic brewed behind polite facades. Staff were warned not to comment. Legal departments reviewed all employee communications. Shareholder meetings were rescheduled. And at the center of the storm stood the quiet origin point. One flight, one seat, one man. Langston received no formal apology directly from a flight crew, but a member of their HR department reached out to request a confidential dialogue. He declined. He did not need confession. He needed accountability. The difference was not semantic. It was strategic. He had spent years watching institutions maneuver to avoid consequence while projecting humility. He would not allow that here. Instead, he accepted a request from the Federal Oversight Committee to deliver a closed-door statement regarding his experience and its broader implications. In that room, under oath, Langston laid out the full sequence of events. He spoke of the systemic erosion he had experienced, the psychological toll of manufactured suspicion, the professional damage inflicted by algorithmic flagging and corporate hesitation. He detailed how inaction had become complicity, how policy had become cover for prejudice, how silence had become a weapon. He offered not rage, but reason, not vengeance, but vision. When he finished, the room was silent, not out of shock, but out of recognition. The truth had filled the space so completely that no space remained for denial. The next day, the committee announced that new guidelines for airline service practices would be enacted, requiring third-party monitoring of in-flight behavior reports, public release of data regarding passenger complaints, and direct channels for high-risk passengers to challenge suspicious flags. The reforms would be named in part after Langston Miles, not as a token, but as acknowledgement. The man who had once been escorted aside in silence had now altered federal aviation policy. News spread further. Civil rights groups organized panels. Universities hosted forums on systemic bias in corporate service models. Editorials praised the dignity with which Langston had confronted cruelty and transformed it into policy. One by one, those who had been silent during the incident began to surface. A passenger from the flight issued an open letter describing the discomfort she had felt witnessing the treatment of Langston, but failing to speak. Another passenger, the man in the patterned blue tie, was identified in internal documents as a business executive at a tech startup, now under social media pressure for its silence. He stepped down from his position. The dominoes continued to fall. The crew member who had scribbled the report against Langston filed for early retirement. The flight supervisor who had approved it was reassigned to administrative duty. The executive vice president who had met Langston in the lounge issued her resignation, citing personal reasons. None of them were forced out by Langston. He had demanded nothing from them. They had chosen to step away under the weight of their own decisions. Langston remained silent through most of it, observing as the machine that had once turned against him now turned against itself. He returned to his firm, not as a figure of pity, but as one of resolve. In the quiet stillness of his study on a Sunday morning, Langston Miles sat by the window with a leather-bound notebook resting on his lap, the sunlight warming the hardwood beneath his feet as the city stretched silently outside. The chaos had passed. The headlines had shifted. The protests had moved to new targets. The policies had been signed. And yet what lingered was not triumph, not the satisfaction of victory, but a quiet, steady presence of meaning that settled deeper than applause or recognition ever could. He sipped his coffee slowly, eyes drifting toward the bookshelf, where the framed commendation from the Department of Transportation now rested beside older honors from another life, from missions no one in his office had known about until recently. The names in those missions had never been spoken, the files sealed, the sacrifices unnamed, but they had built the foundation for the patience that had carried him through silence, through injustice, through fire disguised as policy. His phone buzzed gently on the table. A message had arrived from the regional airline manager who had resigned 2 weeks earlier. No request for redemption, no long explanation, just a line of clarity. "I finally understand. Thank you." Langston did not reply. He closed the message and placed the phone face down. Not because he dismissed it, but because understanding, once earned, needed no acknowledgement. The change had not come from punishment. It had not been forced through shame or fear. It had been shaped through confrontation, through the steady insistence on truth spoken without venom, through the undeniable presence of one man unwilling to accept quiet erasure. And now, beyond the reports and investigations and resignations, something else had begun to grow. The flight attendant who had once turned her eyes away during Langston's humiliation had enrolled in a cultural equity training program on her own. The passenger who had written the open letter of regret now volunteered with an organization focused on inclusive travel experiences. A junior analyst from Langston's own firm, inspired by what she had seen unfold in those weeks of transformation, had launched a project to audit internal corporate response systems to bias complaints, one that now received backing from senior leadership. These were not sweeping revolutions. They were not broadcast or marketed, but they were real. They were seeds of change planted in the soil of one man's refusal to break. Langston did not need to be the center of them. He had never asked to be. What mattered now was that the world, in its quiet corners and quieter systems, had begun to learn. And more importantly, it had begun to unlearn. He stood slowly and moved toward the shelves, selecting a book written decades ago by a civil rights strategist whose words had once kept him grounded during late nights in unfamiliar cities under different names and identities. He opened to a marked page, reread a paragraph, and smiled faintly. The truth, it read, does not fight to be heard. It only waits to be spoken. He closed the book and walked toward his desk where a letter waited, stamped and addressed to a former colleague in a federal agency, one who had supported his quiet push to bring reform without spectacle. In it he had written that justice, if it is to mean anything, must outlive the moments that provoked it. It must continue long after cameras turn away and crowds disperse. It must become the foundation of decisions, not the reaction to damage. He sealed the envelope and placed it near the door. The world outside his home had not changed completely. Airports still filtered passengers through lenses of fear. Corporations still measured worth in metrics that ignored lived experience. Systems still chose efficiency over empathy. But somewhere in that vast mechanism, a new piece had been added. A reminder, a marker, a resistance. It bore no name, no headline, no banner. But it had weight, and it would not be removed. Langston walked out onto his balcony as the city woke beneath him, unaware of his presence, just as it had always been. But now, that anonymity no longer felt like absence. It felt like peace. The war had not been loud. It had not needed to be. The truth had moved quietly, steadily, like water cutting stone. And in the end, the system had learned not through defeat, but through reflection. Those who had inflicted harm were not destroyed. They were changed. Slowly, reluctantly, but honestly. Langston had not needed them to suffer. He had needed them to see. And now they did. The end. If you're following the story and it's got you hooked, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the plot so far? Did any part stand out or hit you hardest? Let me know in the comments. Also, where are you watching from? Drop your location below. I'm always curious to see how far the story travels.